Good to see everyone today. I'm Jack Hunter, editor of Rare Politics. As you can tell from my accent, I'm a native of Brooklyn, so I've been here for... that's not true at all, obviously. I want to introduce my guest before we get started with the video. We're talking about millennials in politics today, and that's a lot of what we do at Rare. I wanted to have guests that could speak to that issue in a way that I think is a little above and beyond what most people can do. First, I'd like to bring out Benny Johnson. Benny Johnson has worked with BuzzFeed, National Review, and is currently the creative director for IJ Review. Next, we're going to have John Fugelsang. Good to see you, Benny. He's an actor, a comedian, a TV personality, and the host of Tell Me Everything on Sirius XM Insight. I get to do that show often. It is a lot of fun and very informative. Our next guest is Vincent Harris. Vincent Harris is the CEO of Harris Media. He's done digital media work for Rick Perry, Ted Cruz, Benjamin Netanyahu, and now serves as Rand Paul's chief digital media strategist. Now, I brought these gentlemen here today and to be with you here today to talk about millennials in politics. And before we get into the video, Newsweek just last week had sort of a summation of the last Republican debate and called it Millennials and the GOP Hopefuls. It's Meet the Parents time. And this is what Newsweek had to say. It's a very short thing. Despite record CNN audiences for its 3 hours of continuous political debate among the Republican presidential primary candidates last week, the GOP failed once again to engage the millennial voters that will need to be successful in the 2016 general election. Instead, the whole thing was more likely to remind millennials of the raucous 2000 version of the movie Meet the Parents. Just as in that comic send-off of what can go wrong when cultures and generations clash, the evening featured non-stop attacks on the millennial generation's beliefs. And on that note, I think we're going to have to take a look at this video of some choice moments from the last Republican debate.
But I am against the recreational use of marijuana. If he wants to change the federal law, get Congress to pass a law to change it and get a president to sign it.
May I respond?
Yes, Senator Paul.
Here's the thing is he doesn't want to make it about medical marijuana, but what if New Jersey's medical marijuana contradicts the federal law? He's saying he will send the federal government in and he will enforce the federal law. That's not consistent with the 10th Amendment. It's not consistent with states' rights, and it's not consistent with a conservative vision for the country. I don't think we should be sending the federal police in to arrest a mother and separate them from their child for giving a medicine to their child for seizure.
Now, if you look at this Pew chart, the younger you go, obviously people want marijuana to be legal, including 63% of Republicans, millennials in that group, want legal marijuana. So definitely, Chris Christie's probably on the wrong side of that.
But we are misleading young people when we tell them that marijuana is just like having a beer. It's not.
This is the Rare Under 40 poll taken last year. 47% of people under 40 think that alcohol is more damaging than marijuana. Very different from what we heard from Ms. Fiorina. If you look at this poll, and this is Democrat, Independent, Republican, in every category, everybody thinks that alcohol is worse than marijuana. And that's looking at millennials. This is Rare Under 40. If you look at the age groups, the younger you go, it's the same sort of attitude. 18 to 29, we see that big red mark there. Alcohol is more harmful. This is people under 40, and you can't see it here. It's white, African American, Hispanic, Asian. Each racial group, if you look at it, all of them think under 40, Rare Under 40's poll, alcohol is worse.
So do you believe that Islam is consistent with the Constitution?
No, I don't. I do not. I would not advocate that we put a Muslim in charge of this nation. I absolutely would not agree with that.
And this is a Gallup poll from 2015. 60% of Americans would have no problem in electing a Muslim for president. The only thing that's more unpopular is an atheist and a socialist. And if you look at the research, if you look at the polling, many polls, Gallup, Pew, what we do with Rare Under 40, the younger you go, the more open, the more tolerant, you have different attitudes with the voters and the general American population, and that reflects where millennials are coming from. It's a different sort of attitude. A lot of what we do at Rare, and what I do as editor at Rare Politics, we come from a center-right perspective. We come from a more libertarian, conservative perspective. As we try to talk about issues like smaller government and protecting liberty and increasing our freedoms, without a lot of what we saw on that Republican debate stage, where it's not about making people scared about things like marijuana in the way we've done in the past. A lot more open about racial issues. We had a different take on what we saw in Ferguson and Baltimore than a lot of center-right publications out there. Gay marriage, we're very pro-gay marriage. The reason we're trying to do these things is we think millennials have a different attitude, even young millennial Republicans or people inclined to vote Republican, than their parents did and their grandparents did. That relates to the business we're in, that relates to advertising and attitudes and across the board. So let's get to our guests, and I was going to ask you first, Benny. Benny's a man. How are you? Good. And thank all of you gentlemen for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Isn't that how you guys wanted to start your day, with Chris Christie and Rand Paul bickering? Shouldn't that be like True Detective Season 3? Like the two of them have to team up to solve crimes?
I loved it. That's why I tuned into the debate. Chris Christie and Rand Paul hate each other so much they could both sing lead for the Eagles. It's amazing to watch them just go at it.
And that's pretty true.
Can we just do this for the rest of the family?
But Benny, what do you see? And I have to admit, I'm somewhat of an imposter. I didn't quite make the millennial cut, but here we are. We're talking about millennials. Benny, you are a millennial. We sort of work on the right
29.
side. 29. You're a millennial through and through. What do you see with different attitudes, especially on the right, people inclined to vote Republicans, your age, slightly older, a little bit younger, that's different maybe, the things I just talked about and sort of some of the examples we saw in the Republican debate?
That's different from... Well, okay, so for me, and at least based on what we've seen at IJ, I work at a site called IJ, Independent Journal, what we see when we watch the debate is this fascinating break between generations. And I don't think it's right or left. It's when you watch a debate... Actually, let's take a poll. When you watch a debate, what are you actually watching? Are you looking at the screen, or are you looking at Twitter? Maybe Vine, maybe like what your friends are saying on Facebook, what people are doing in real time. You're watching the comedy around the debate, right? Like you're consuming the debate through alternative channels other than the actual broadcast. And so what we experimented with was just doing live Vines in real time to troll the debate. And so, if Carly goes after Donald Trump and says every woman in America heard what you said when you said my face couldn't be president, and then you cut to Donald Trump and you put Taylor Swift's Bad Blood over that, that gets a million loops. And it speaks to kind of the way that people are consuming their political news these days. It's not coming direct from the top anymore. It's these auxiliary entities that people are taking and sharing and making their own, which is how young people are consuming their news. So the idea that a young person looks at the debate and thinks for 3.5 hours with a pen in their mouth, going, that's very interesting, that offended me,
I don't think that's not really what I'm saying. I'm saying that, I'm, and you probably are as well, friends with a lot of people who are 25 and libertarian or conservative who watch some of the statements made on that debate and have a very different reaction than their parents and grandparents do. That's a real thing.
Right.
That is a real thing with millennials, and it does relate to our business and the Republican Party, and if they're going to continue to exist and survive and, sort of get with it.
Two huge issues: homosexuality and the use of marijuana, like gay marriage and smoking weed. I think you showed right there quite clearly that there is a massive generational shift.
Right.
And I think you really you sincerely see that, right or left.
Sure. Well, John, let me ask you. So we talk about these issues on your show, sort of more left-leaning. What's your take on that in this conversation, and just what we're talking about millennials having different attitudes?
Well, I think that the risk is assuming that millennials are one giant monolithic block that think the same. And the fact is that urban millennials have much more in common with 45-year-old urbanites than they do with a 24-year-old rural single mom who happens to be a millennial. So I don't really think that we could, approach it in terms of that all thought is the same. The issues are generational, no doubt, and I'm not the first to talk about how the GOP has a millennial problem. But the one thing that does unite millennials with every other demographic of the population, generally, they don't show up to vote. And that's the real problem we have. It's more of a getting people involved in the democracy than who's going to win the election battle. I'm a big proponent of getting people out to vote more, and our country has systematically made it difficult to get people to vote. We still vote on the first Tuesday of November because 2 centuries ago, You had to work on planting your crops until the end of October, go to church on Sunday, have the Monday to travel by mule to your polling place in the next town, then vote on Tuesday. We are controlled by the habits of dead guys. When Election Day should be a holiday or a whole week or make it much easier to vote, the powers that be, because it's never really been liberal versus conservative, it's always been aristocracy versus democracy. The aristocrats who founded this country thought only their class should be allowed to vote. And so we still see that. When we had the Supreme Court gutting the Voting Rights Act 2 years ago, it wasn't really about keeping the African-American vote down. It made it harder for low-income folks, seniors, and college kids to vote. There are districts in this country where you can vote with an NRA ID, but not your college ID. So it's great that millennials are finding ways to engage politically and original ways. Some might poo-poo that it's not as substantive as poring over U.S. News and World Report the next day. But it is an engaged generation, but that doesn't mean anything if we don't show up to vote and convince folks born in this period that it is in their acute interest to show up to vote.
Can I just say really quickly, I'm from Iowa. There are still many people who take mules to vote. And so I think we need to be sensitive to that.
But what I would say, millennials are going to be the largest voting bloc in the country in the very near future. We're talking about 85 to 90 million people. The question I would have are the attitudes that we saw just in a few snippets of these polls that we just saw, would those continue to be part of what defines millennials, or will they get older and become different on those issues too?
Absolutely.
There's probably a split.
Absolutely.
But they will be voting.
And millennials are already the most liberal voting bloc in America, which is not to say they vote. But of course, their idea of liberal tends to mean more socially liberal. They favor a strong safety net, if you believe all the Pew polls and all the other accounts. But again, it's all a matter of will they show up to vote. Zipcar did a great poll, and they found that millennials are people who would rather part with a car than part with a phone. They don't view car ownership as necessary. They view it as a hassle, and that's one of the areas where millennials have more in common with urbanites than with rural or suburban millennials.
Well, and that brings me to...
I saw a similar study where people would pick their phone over their spouse that were younger too, so I think that's pretty sad about our society.
There's a lot of middle-aged people who would make that choice as well.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you, Vincent. So Vincent was once called the man who invented the Republican internet. And I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you've worked for Ted Cruz and Rick Perry and Benjamin Netanyahu and Rand Paul, that a lot of Republicans weren't as media savvy as maybe they should have been, and you're sort of the guy that's shown them the way. Is that an accurate statement?
Well, I think that the party's finally catching up. I think it took 2 cycles of us getting our butts kicked by President Obama, who without a doubt ran obviously such a wonderful digital operation, and really, I'd say from a democracy perspective, really helped move our society forward from the ability of campaigns to actually use the internet and social media and online organizing as a means to get people out to vote. Some interesting things that I wanted to share with you all today, even just going on your question about how millennials think about that interaction that we just saw. 45% of people that are engaged on Senator Paul's Facebook page right now who are engaging with his content are between the ages of 18 and 34. 42% of his overall website traffic. The most common person that visits randpaul.com is on their mobile device and is between 25 and 34 years old. So that's exactly what we're here talking about today. So I would say that people got very interested if they weren't already. All of those facts are in the past 2 weeks since this debate. So Senator Paul certainly is somebody who does very well with millennials. Messages, I think, like the one that you just showed us. And we are thinking every day on the campaign when millennials have so many choices, unlike my grandparents who went home after work every day and they had one of 3 broadcast news outlets to look at. Millennials expect what's called niche news. They expect news to be delivered to themselves, to be personalized. They expect it to be entertaining. They expect it to be pithy. So what we are thinking about every day for Senator Paul is how do we pair things that are fun and entertaining with the context of serious policy issues. And it's not always easy because people would more rather be looking at cat gifs on BuzzFeed or be seeing pictures of Kim Kardashian's rear than they would talk about policy issues.
Well, and that takes us to millennials and how they get their news. This is a Pew poll from 2015. It says millennials rely on Facebook. As you just said, for their news far more than any other source. About 6 in 10 online millennials, 61%. Benny, I work at Rare. We know that, the millennial generation, and as you just said, Vincent, are not watching, an hour of news on Dan Rather at night and, not reading their morning paper with their coffee, and then that's the end of it. They're getting their news online. A lot of them are getting on Facebook. You work at IJ Review. I work at Rare. We realize this reality. That's your news feed now, correct?
Sure.
I mean, that's how, coming from a center-right perspective, that's how you reach people.
Jack,
Sure.
There's a wonderful book by a Princeton political scientist named Marcus Pryor, and the book's called Post-Broadcast Democracy. And he studies a group of voters and gives them the choice. If you could watch news or nothing, what would you watch? Guess what they watched? News. If you could engage with news, sports, or entertainment, news dropped to between 20 and 30%. So when people have options, they aren't picking to watch news and politics. They are picking things that are more interesting. So that's what makes this so difficult, and what makes my job so interesting and difficult too, is how do we actually deliver political news and information to our younger folks in our society?
Likewise, it's telling that you showed a clip of a debate about medical cannabis, because that is an issue that young people do care about, whereas a lot of the debate focused on illegal immigration, which is not an issue that's of tremendous importance to millennials or most people outside of the GOP primary demographic. I mean, illegal immigration is at a net zero increase. There have been record deportations under this president. There's never been more National Guard troops at the border than there are now. It's a political football, and millennials kind of see through that, and that's why they're more interested in issues like marriage equality, issues like not locking people up for a flower that grew here long before white folks showed up. Millennials also generally know that pot was only made illegal in the 1930s. So legalized cannabis is technically the conservative point of view.
And it's a different set of priorities with millennials and sort of some of what you're saying. That same Pew poll, and this goes to what you're saying, Vincent, and you as well, John. June 2015, Pew, millennial Facebook users are exposed to more political content on the social media site than our Gen Xers or Boomers. So they're seeing more, looking at their Facebook. That's 61%. But millennials are less interested in politics than older generations at the same time. Now, what that tells me, and this is me speculating, is that they're seeing more political content, but, if you're just watching Fox News or you're just watching MSNBC, you're getting one perspective. If you're looking at your Facebook, and you have some friends who are on the right, who are on the left, who are apathetic, who don't care, you're seeing more diversity of opinion. If you're seeing more diversity of opinion on your news feed, which is Facebook, aren't you going to kind of see the BS on both sides a little bit more and maybe not care about politics as much? Do millennials have a different attitude about politics in general than their parents and grandparents? Any of you?
I think the greatest generation parents complained that their boomer kids weren't interested in paying attention to what's going on in the world, and I think boomers complained that Gen X kids weren't paying attention to what's going on in the world, and I think it's a common lament when you hear people say that millennials aren't engaged enough.
That just goes on and on forever. I think to Vince's point, what you need to do is apply, not throw away the entire model. So I'm a reporter, right? So you need to break news, you need to cover news. These are heavy issues of the day. When you're dealing with the tax code, you can't just buzzsaw it with a chainsaw or light it on fire, put it through a wood chipper.
You can't.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know if you guys saw that video.
Staying out of the libertarian fight.
But you have to find a way to properly tell that story, but to do it with the tools that we have right now. So, in a changing media environment, when Donald Trump gives out another presidential candidate's phone number, okay, on stage, this happened to Lindsey Graham in South Carolina. He reads the number. The reflex of every reporter in the universe is to call that number immediately. What happened is everybody got Lindsey Graham's sad voicemail, and it destroyed his phone. Okay, so what a unique and fascinating thing that happened in politics at this moment, right? In a world without the internet or without the social web, poor Lindsey Graham would have had maybe one option, right? He could put out a press release and go on 60 Minutes and sit there and be asked, what do you think about Donald Trump? Well, I don't like Donald Trump. What do you feel? I thought it was mean that he took my phone. Like, that's what would have happened. In a world without the social web, that's his only option. Poor Lindsey Graham, he got trolled big time. What he has today And what we worked on with him, and within 8 hours of Donald Trump giving out his cell phone, is the ability to go and respond in a way. Our interview with him was to go and destroy a bunch of flip phones. And he lit them on fire, and he hit them with a sword, and he dropped bricks on them, and he threw them off buildings, and he finally has some quippy little line at the end, Donald Trump line. But that was his interview. That was his interview. That was his ability to make his own news and talk to an outlet and do an interview. And to the tune of 3.5 million views, that remains, I'm sorry, this is going to sound braggadocious, but it remains the biggest viral moment of 2016 so far. Because somebody had the ability to get out of the box and talk to a generation, speak to the internet the way it likes to be spoken to, and do something that's really going to translate. And what the comments on that YouTube are fascinating. Look through the comments on the end of that video. I didn't even know this was happening. I Googled Donald Trump, Lindsey Graham. This was hysterical. I had no idea this happened. This is really funny. Who is Lindsey Graham? Should I vote for him for president?
Right.
What's going on here? And it started this fascinating, because you approached it differently. And final point, I know I'll get off the soapbox in a second. It takes the same reporting. We didn't throw out the model. It takes the same reporting acumen to do this as it would have been to book him for 60 Minutes. You need to have a source. You need to have a rapport with the campaign. The campaign needs to be able to come in and give you the time, and you need to get an exclusive. It's the same tools that reporters have always used. It's just we're applying them to a social web era. And to the benefit...
A quicker edit turnaround.
What's that?
A quicker edit turnaround.
And we did it in real time, essentially. We did it in real time. The truth is that when we pitched Lindsey Graham, his flack said, "This is a great idea." She gets back to us at 9 o'clock at night. She says, "This is a great idea, but I'm in my pajamas, and Lindsey Graham doesn't have his phone, and he doesn't use email. So I'm going to have to drive to his house, and in his pajamas, they had this conversation, and at midnight, they're like, fine, we'll do it." And at 10 o'clock the next morning, we had that video.
It was entertaining, easy to digest, quick turnaround, obviously. And Vince, you were going to say something, but that's right in your wheel. I mean, you have to deliver this. It's not 60 Minutes era anymore. It's different.
I'd say a few things. The first is Benny's starting to remind me of Donald Trump in the debates up here, monopolizing all of the time.
Sorry?
Joking. Thank you. Thanks for the laughs. Thanks for the laughs. First is that I agree with you completely that every younger generation doesn't care about politics when they're younger. And when they start to get older and they start to make more money and they start to have a family, they're going to care more about politics. So I completely agree with that point. Second point...
Well, I think millions do. The lament of the older generation is that they don't care about it.
Yes. The second point is the discussion of people being exposed to other viewpoints on Facebook is one that is definitely good for society. It's called incidental exposure, and it didn't occur before social media. Think about before social media. We had Fox News and MSNBC. That was much more polarized than social media, where some of your friends might be conservative, but some of them might be liberal. And my third point is, I think of things at the end of an election. Do we win or do we lose? And I think the most untested part of everything that we're talking about is, does 3.5 million video views actually win Lindsey Graham an election? Lindsey Graham is polling as an asterisk right now. 0%, 0 votes in every state. So what did 3.5 million views, even with virality, get him? That is the real question that I think about every day, because I have to win an election. So how do I make something entertaining, but how do I also get millennials to support my candidate and then win the election?
I'm a reporter. I care about my viewers. I honestly don't care who wins. I care about my viewers and creating content that they're going to enjoy at the same time, breaking down a model. So
I'm a comedian, so I root for Ted Cruz or Donald Trump.